Hello, beautiful ladies. Welcome back to Women's Hour, also known as Wamen Hour, which I was just trying to explain to Bethel here, who is our our very own guest for tonight. A one-time guest from back when the show was on Academic Agents channel. She's joined us tonight because we had a super chat requesting us to talk about 1 Timothy, chapter 2. So she's our scripture expert to talk us through that. But before I get on to the topics or even the guests, I do want to make a special announcement, which is that I've scheduled a charity stream. I finally got the courage up to get a babysitter for my kids so I can spend upwards of 12 hours playing video games for and then under the pretense of raising money for charity. So clear your schedules, take a day off work, do whatever you have to do to get Wednesday, the 7th of December free, and you can watch me play through Resident Evil 4 for the first time. I'm hoping in one sitting. I'm going to sit down at 10 a.m. local time and going to try and just stay where I am until the game is finished. I'm going to stream it all.
Such a good game. Such a good game.
Yes, and Cows will be joining. I've invited a bunch of people to drop in as they feel like it, so anyone you can think of, they've been invited for talking about video games. So do join for that. I'm going to keep reminding you until it happens. And this is another reminder to leave your super chats, because we do address the topics that we get super chat recommendations for. So we'll be reading those tonight, and the highest paying super chat of this show will become the next topic that we take on. So I guess I should introduce the rest of my panel at this point. Thank you, Bethel, for joining us. Before we move on to the rest of the panel, would you like to briefly introduce yourself? I'm so bad with introductions, I'd rather just let you do it.
Sure. So I am Bethel McGrew, Dr. Bethel McGrew, I guess I should say. I went to all that bother to get a PhD. I should probably mention that I have it once in a while. So I have a PhD in math, which I never use because I wanted to be a writer instead. And so I do that, and I float around writing at various places, National Review, First Things, my own Substack. And I still tweet. I will tweet as long as there is a Twitter, at bmcgroovy. And so I'm sort of a social critic. I write about this, that, and the other thing, whatever interests me at the moment. And I love movies and should have watched the movie that you all have watched tonight, but I'll enjoy hearing you guys' commentary on that very much. And I have styled myself as sort of a Christian humanist. That's like a catchphrase that I use. People are always curious about. So I guess that makes me a sort of go-to person to ask about Christian-y things, which is why I'm here to instruct you all about 1 Timothy 2, I guess.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. Please follow Bethel on Twitter and on Substack, because I love what you write.
Thank you.
It's like so fresh compared to all of the like extremely online things that I consume. So
I really appreciate that. That is my goal for sure.
And we have returning for another show. Let's take Havenwards. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
You're welcome. I'm mainly here because it's my partner suggested the film and then strong-armed me into talking about it. So
You're really a sweetheart for coming on here to talk about movies because you're, as you suggested, your other half is a professional movie stream live streamer. So you're constantly appearing on live streams to talk about films. But I won't be making terrible puns. Is the difference here tonight?
That is a relief. That is a relief.
And Cows is with us. Thanks for joining us, Cows.
Of course. Happy to be here as always.
So, without further ado, Double Indemnity. It's a first watch for me, as requested by our super chat, and I'm a fan. I liked it. Very noir, very influential on the films that came after it. Before we review it, I guess I'll say we're going to talk about the plot and the characters. So, spoilers if you don't know what happens in it. Bethel, you can go and make yourself a cup of coffee if you don't want to. If you don't want to know, we won't go into really fine points. We're just going to do a little quick review, 15 minutes, and then we'll get on to talking about 1 Timothy chapter 2, as requested. So, let's start with Cows. Okay, you watched it like an hour ago, right?
Yeah. So, me in my fashion, I forgot what this week's topic was on. Poe reminded me a few hours prior, and then I got Mr. Panama Hat and myself to sit down and watch it together, and it was awesome. We both really enjoyed it. The entire time we were thinking, just because of the way that it's written with the main character doing a lot of narrating, we were thinking this would work very, very well as a novel. And mid-film, we had to stop and look up to see if it was, and it is. It was a novel published in the 30s.
It's written here.
And yeah, it was a really great film. Like you were saying before, very influential on films of the time. At times, it almost felt like a modern parody of what we would think of as noir, but it's just so good. The entire time we were thinking that the main guy was literally me character. So yeah, we both really enjoyed that. So whoever suggested that, Heyman Words, did you say that was your significant other?
Yeah, Proper Horror Show. She suggested it because we watched it a few months ago.
Oh,
we had a kind of film noir night.
Yeah, so pass along your thanks. It was a really great film.
I will do. She loves it. It's to be fair, I do as well. I like I was watching a few clips of it earlier just to kind of refresh my memory. I love the kind of staccato dialogue. There's a scene. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Because
you sound great.
Excellent. My mic is a bit sort of excitable at times. I was just loving the way the dialogue is so kind of. It's very staccato. It's very deadpan, and it also just allows the viewer to just. It trusts the viewer to keep up. So the scene where the insurance salesman and Barbara Stanwyck's character meet for the first time, and they're flirting, but in this kind of really, it's not obvious, it's not overplayed, it's very kind of it's all in the subtext, and it's a really lovely moment. There's a lot of kind of fun chemistry and fun tension, and the film just expects you to keep up. Whereas I feel like modern films are like, no, guys, they're flirting. Just in case you missed it, they're flirting. Have you missed it, guys? They're flirting. Whereas the film is just like, that's cool. You'll keep up. We trust you.
Yeah, there's that such an immediate sort of attraction between them that it's implied just by the way that the shot, her coming down on the balcony, like you can tell what he's thinking about her, and then the way that they interact, it's this very intense dialogue of like being very witty and sort of like playing with each other. In the words that they use and what they're saying in this way that's like so it's so intense and intellectual that I find it hard to believe that there's anyone on earth who flirts this way, but it's so entertaining to watch.
They're just so fast. Someone would flirt with me like that.
And you kind of get this sense just within minutes that it's not just a sort of fleeting attraction, but they have this I don't want to say that like it's like love at first sight, because there's nothing really soppy or sentimental about it. It's just like an intense connection that these two people have. This kind of, you get an impression of this bored housewife and this insurance salesman who's coming to visit her, and that attraction between them is what drives. You have to buy that for the entire plot of the film to make sense, because without going into too much detail, there's murder, fraud. the equivalent of $1 million is on the line. I looked up the the inflation for the amount that they're talking. It's like $10,000,
Yeah.
and it's basically like a $1 million scam that they're pulling, and it's all in service of not just money, but also in service of this attraction that especially our hero, our anti-hero, what would you call him? Fills for the leading lady, the femme fatale to be. I don't know. It's almost like she invented that genre. I have no idea if she's the first femme fatale, but she acts as if she is.
Yeah, she's so kind of. Embodies both that kind of deeply attractive and you kind of, as a viewer, you sort of almost fall for her, but at the same time, she's got this very kind of sinister, hard edge underneath. There's characters like that as well in a lot of sort of Bogart, sort of hard-boiled detective films. Lots of the dames who are like, you feel instantly protective towards, and kind of the film kind of makes you want to kind of look after them, and then after a while you realise that they are the kind of double-crossing bitch underneath it all. Sorry, I shouldn't swear.
I think I don't think you can really call it a film noir unless it's got that final like twist at the end where not like a really stupid twist like an M. Night Shyamalan movie where like literally the thing you were watching wasn't really happening, but like just a final double cross. You're kind of expecting it, but it still kind of catches you like no.
For sure.
Brilliant. I love these this like 40s supermarket that they go around.
Yeah.
And all the outfits and hats. I mean, watching anything like made in the past is always kind of entertaining, just on a purely archaeological
Stylish.
interest. Yeah, the style of it and the weird little artifacts. Yeah, even watching TV that was made like 15 years ago is like weirdly nostalgic because especially things in supermarkets, they look so dated so quickly. I was watching Peep Show the other day and I thought, it was like, this looks like the supermarket I walked around when I was 10. Can't go without mentioning Keys though. He steals the show because he's a sort of unexpected character. He's not a policeman. He's not really super ethical or anything. He's just this clever guy it's like he's not even really likable. He's just as an audience you love him because he's so clever and because he's kind of a stickler and he's going to catch him out eventually.
One of the things I like with the film is that like it sets up this the very kind of Chad heroic, sort of conventionally attractive, tall, romantic lead of the male protagonist. And then actually the guy who ends up being the hero of the film, really, who catches them out in their plot and exposes it, is this kind of short, ratty little man who just happens to be very clever and kind of picking up on what's going on under the surface. And Horror Show and I were talking about it earlier, and she was saying, is that almost like a screenwriter insert? They're like, no, trust me, guys, the nerds are the ones you want, which is one reading of it. But yeah, I like, there's an interesting thing of the morality of it where, from memory, it was a few weeks ago now I watched it, but from memory, the protagonist is kind of eventually feels he knows he's going to get caught, but he also feels kind of torn about what he's done and the part he's played. So there is a moral sort of imperative within the film. But at the same time, it's interesting that kind of justice comes in the form of this kind of quite non-heroic little character. I wonder we're joking that's almost sort of slightly subversive in a way, but it's, I don't know, I find it very interesting seeing that the kind of, even though he's been part of like a murder and a fraud, he has a moral redemption, and the film doesn't kind of let go of that moral aspect. Whereas I think potentially a modern retelling might want you to be more on the side of the plotters in a way that this, this of 1944 doesn't want you to be on their side. It wants you to go along with them, but it doesn't want you to root for them by the end.
I think none of that is even really a spoiler because it's right there in the first few minutes where he's introducing, he's saying, "Oh, I bet you're wondering how I got in this crazy situation." And he's explaining how he got there, and he says right up at the start, the first scene of the film, "I killed a man, and I did it for money, and I did it for a woman." that's the plot of the film. And he's addressing Keyes in this monologue that spans the entire plot of the film. And he says, "Oh, Keyes, I never had you fooled. You knew it wasn't murder, and you knew it wasn't. Sorry, you knew it wasn't suicide, and you knew it wasn't an accident. It was murder, just like you said." And yeah, I think that's the thing, is that he really doesn't have Neff, the insurance salesman, really doesn't have a good excuse for committing the murder, except that a very attractive woman sort of asked him to do it. She didn't even really have to persuade him or trick. I mean, there was some trickery involved, but she didn't need to, give him no way out. Like he was very willing to go along with it just for a woman, for this femme fatale. There's kind of irredeemable, but not. He wasn't a moustache twirling villain either. He was just he was a patsy from the very beginning.
For sure.
When you think about it, his character, you put yourself in 1940. That was like the epitome of, like, I hate to use the internet language here, but like he was a Sigma male. He's what the women were going for, like, how the femme fatale, like you were saying, interacts with him, and even her stepdaughter, the person who gets off his daughter, who they kind of go at it in the film. Just the way that they interact with him just kind of shows this sort of power that the audience assumes that he has, and that the character probably presumes that he has, this sort of way with women, this sort of suaveness to him. But in the end, I think it's some interesting commentary about how that was kind of, it led to his downfall, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I promised 15 minutes, and we've had it. There's so much more to say, but in the interest of time, and in the interest of letting everyone enjoy the film if they haven't seen it already, maybe we'll leave it there. That's a good introduction, I think.
Would recommend.
I'll head off now, but I'd love to leave one more recommendation with Barbara Stanwyck in, which is, I believe it's, I want to say Christmas in Connecticut. I was about to say in Cincinnati. It's not Cincinnati. Christmas in Connecticut, which is a very kind of madcap French farce type film, and she's playing a very different, very humorous character. I would say that one is a little bit more subversive, but if you want more kind of films from this kind of era, totally recommend that one as well.
All right. Well, thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, as a Connecticutian, I will have to give that a watch.
Oh, it's a delight. You'll love it. I'd love to know what you think.
All right, awesome.
My battery's dying, so I will head off now.
All right, you're leaving me with the Americans.
Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Good luck. Good night.
Thanks. All right. I won't stop sharing because I've got our next topic is right here on the screen. Look at that, I prepared and everything. This is another suggestion. And before we move on, I will take another super chat from our regular patron, DRT is King, for $10. This is the same suggestion from last week, talking about the developed world's obsession with teenage romance, and using the film The Whisper of the Heart as a lens to discuss the topic. Although I'd argue that The Whisper of the Heart is developed world, not Western world, so that was probably a careful choice of words. So to any of my ladies who are watching and the ones on the panel tonight, if you want to join me and watch The Whisper of the Heart and maybe review that and talk about teenage romance. Like I said last week, I love teen romances. Just kind of a guilty pleasure for me. So we'll be talking about that either next week or in another week following.
All
right. Bethel, would you like to introduce our... Am I in the wrong... How did I get to the wrong Bible verse?
This looks like 2 Thessalonians. There we go.
Yeah, somehow I think I managed to click on something
so I think
wrong.
you're looking for 1 Timothy 2?
Yeah, I thought I was too. So where did it go? Am I turning the page? Is that how it's working?
So click in the 1 Timothy 2 box, and I think it'll give you the option to... Yeah, that... Oh, that's it. Yeah. So click on chapter 2. That'll take you there. We are.
This one?
This is where we're at. Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yep.
Sorry about that. Would you like the King James version or a different version?
Oh, I'm a King James girl.
Go for it. So. Would you like to read it or shall I?
Well, wait. This is the New King James. Can we have like the regular?
Oh yeah.
King
Sorry,
James?
no. Not the new one. We want trad King James. Where am I
Thank
looking?
you. Return. Here we go. There we go.
Yeah, return. See,
Okay.
you are extremely online. Don't try to deny
Yeah,
it.
I am. Yeah. Here we go. I exhort, therefore, that first of all, supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty, for this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who will have all men to be saved, and to come unto the knowledge of the truth. For there is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man, Christ Jesus, who gave himself a ransom for all, to be testified in due time. Whereunto I am ordained a preacher and an apostle. I speak the truth in Christ, and why not? A teacher of the Gentiles in faith and verity. I will, therefore, that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands, without wrath and doubting. In like manner also, that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with broided hair, or gold, or pearls, or costly array, but, which becometh women professing godliness, with good works. Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. For Adam was first formed, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman, being deceived, was in the transgression. Notwithstanding, she shall be saved in childbearing, if they continue in faith and charity and holiness with sobriety.
Thanks very much. Just to make sure that we have the super chat topic in mind, I will read the super chat that we got for this, requesting this Bible verse. The sentiment behind 1 Timothy 2:11-15, and where women's voices should be in society, how women's voices can benefit right-wing circles, and how intense anti-women femininity is a cancer on the right. So I think that poster was getting a lot for a lot of questions for his.
There's a lot in there, yeah. Well, and I mean, it's a funny. There's a whole sort of debate going on in certain pockets of American Christianity right now, like extremely online American Christianity, I should say, over like Christian nationalism and what that looks like. And you've got some voices out there who are saying that America is a gynocracy right now. And maybe we should even, reconsider this whole idea of women voting. Yeah, there is that strain sort of out there. But so
it's also in here, by the way. It's on this very stream, so it's not. It's very close to home for us.
Yeah.
We have these arguments every day on Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's interesting to go back to these source texts and say, okay, what is Paul actually saying? How do we understand Paul in his context, and what does it mean for our context? And so, I was thinking about this myself and crowdsourcing a little bit and talking with my mom, because my mom is a Christian scholar and academic, and like me, she has a very feisty personality. She is not one to sit down and be quiet. She has very much has an opinion, and will sometimes vigorously criticize male Christian scholars and academics. And so, clearly she believes that she has a voice and a place in Christian society and academic society generally there. And so then how does that square with this passage? Well, I think the first thing to understand is that in Paul's day, in Paul's cultural context, so many spheres didn't even exist. I mean, there was no such thing as Christian academia. There was no such thing as Christian journalism, right? So the pastor, the church leader, combined so many different things in himself, so that there wasn't such a thing as a space or a sphere where Christian women could be vocally criticizing Christian men, but in a way that was divorced from church discipline, or like direct spiritual authority or spiritual shepherding. So that's the context I think Paul is primarily speaking to here. I think that phrase usurp authority is important there here. He'll talk about qualifications for pastors, where he says a big qualification is that a man should be able to manage his own household. So he's envisioning a complementarian structure. Man has authority over the wife, over his family, and that's a mark of his competence in being able to pastor a church. So this is all sort of tied together, and we get Adam and Eve, that God ordained this complementarity of man and woman before the fall. So it's a feature, not a bug. And so he's saying within the church, it's inappropriate, it's out of line for a woman to be exercising pastoral authority over a man, and for her to be disciplining him in that kind of ecclesial context. So that's my my short intro there. Feel free to ask further questions.
Yeah, I mean, I've got loads of questions. I guess we'll start off with people who are not so biblically literate, including myself in that. So there's a lot of Christians I expect watching, and I think a large portion of Christians believe that everything written in the Bible is sort of from God, that it's it's special in a sense. It's it's all accurate and not really up for debate. But for those people who are looking for wisdom in the Bible that's more sort of from an earthly perspective, it's nothing magical. It's just kind of, but it is still useful. I think it's worth talking about who Paul was, who is Timothy. What is the whole context of this entire
backing up
letter? Yeah,
right,
go on.
right, okay.
Take us through it.
Zoom out more. Okay, who is Paul? So Paul is a vital figure in the early development of Christianity shortly after the death of Christ. Paul begins as actually a fierce Jewish persecutor of early Christians. He's very zealous for Judaism, for the purity of Jewish law, and so he regarded the early Christians as a blasphemous little cult that had broken off from Judaism that needed to be stamped out. So, and his name was Saul originally when he was in that role, and so he presides over the first martyrdom of a Christian named Stephen, who is publicly stoned, and Paul is the guy who kind of watches over the cloaks of the men who are stoning Stephen, and so that's it's very cinematic, you can sort of picture him just sitting there watching this happen. And little does Saul know at the time, that he's going to have this Damascus Road experience. Literally, this is the origin of the phrase Damascus Road experience. He's on his way on the Damascus Road to go and kill some more Christians when he sees this blinding light from heaven, and he has a vision of Jesus, and he hears a voice asking Saul, 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 why are you persecuting me? As if Jesus is personally taking Saul's persecution of Christians. So he goes temporarily blind, and there are other people around him who can confirm this. And so from that experience, he converts pretty much immediately. It's this very singular turnaround. And then he emerges out of that completely changed, and now completely zealous for Christianity. And so then he becomes this force of nature, where he's traveling everywhere, spreading the Christian gospel, planting churches, keeping in touch with churches, writing letters to churches, and those letters were pulled together and became a substantial chunk of the New Testament. And so Timothy is a young protege of his. Timothy had a Greek heritage, and so he was one of the young people who Paul converted and trained to become a young pastor. And so we have two letters that Paul wrote to him, and they're very affectionate. They have this sort of father-son quality to them. And Paul is basically prepping Timothy to go and be a pastor. And there's all sorts of, older minister, younger minister type wisdom in there. And so this is where Paul is starting to work out, the first set of rules to govern how church authority is going to look, how churches are going to be structured.
Yeah, great. That's a brilliant summary. Thanks.
Thank you.
Something else I wanted to pick out of here before we move on to sort of just talking about it generally, but I think it's interesting the way that I think Paul has his letters are good. I like them. He has a good way of writing, and I think what I like picking out of this is that he describes the relationship between men and women in this kind of fractal nature, where the prototypical a man and woman are Adam and Eve, and that relationship is also to be expressed in the man and wife relationship, and then also in the family, in the household. And then if a man's really good at running a household, maybe he'll be good enough to run a church, and that's
Yes.
that same theme of of how men should relate to women should be carried in. It should be reflected in every level. They should all rhyme with each other.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And going back to Adam and Eve, specifically pre-fall Adam and Eve, because you sometimes will hear this notion that men having authority over or dominating women is like a function of the fall. But that's pretty clearly contradicted in the way that Paul lays this out here, because he's like, no, like from the beginning, Adam is supposed to, yes, right. Thank you for highlighting that. For Adam was first formed, then Eve. And there's this clear notion that Adam had the responsibility and the authority there. And Eve is the one who sins first and kind of messes everything else up. And it's like the husband should have known better, like Adam should have been on watch there.
Yeah. It's the thing about the reason I wanted you to introduce Paul and Timothy is that I think there's a lot of argument. Well, we talked about this in the DMs a little bit. Like, how much of this is Paul just reflecting his own personal sort of experiences and biases onto, and then that just becomes like he was writing this not like Moses coming down with the stone tablets to tell everyone how to live. He was writing to his friend Timothy, and then that has become the basis for a lot of
sure. So you're getting
laws.
into this, yeah. So you're getting into this question of what is scriptural inspiration, right? What does inspiration mean in this New Testament context where we don't have physical tablets etched with the commandments of God, right? And so, yeah, this is a huge debate in Christianity, in conservative Christianity, and I think my own view is I wouldn't call myself an inerrantist, so I wouldn't say that I'm committed to every line of the Bible has to be completely flawless. There can't be any mistakes anywhere. I don't think I would take that view, but I do think that the Bible is inspired, and I do specifically think that Paul is inspired. And I think Paul was a curmudgeon. I think he's a very colorful character that definitely comes through. And we could even say that he was maybe a tad bit misogynistic, like just the way. I mean, he never married, right? It's you can imagine this this old curmudgeonly single guy, and I don't know like how well he got to know a lot of women. And so, yeah, maybe he had a slightly limited idea of what women could do or whatever. But I think he is right when he outlines a woman's position in the church. I mean, even my mom. It was interesting when I was discussing this with her. She was mentioning how she's a little bit uncomfortable even giving a lecture on some of her biblical writing as like the main presentation in a church service, because like even that she feels like she's sort of taking the spotlight or the attention away from the male pastor who should sort of be leading and guiding the service, which I think is sort of interesting how even in that sort of subtle way she wants to make sure that gender roles are appropriately honored. So even though I'm not in fact an inerrantist, I think as I think about this passage and I think about the cultural context for it, I think it's correct. I don't see a reason to dismiss it, and I think it harmonizes very well with, like you were saying, the whole story of man and woman, of Adam and Eve. It's all it comes together in a way that makes sense, I think.
Yeah, I don't want to be like the feminist on the show, and I think everyone watching would want me to would know that it does pain me a little bit to take the devil's advocate position, but it is so hard for me to not just instinctively think, well, what if the woman is right and the man who's trying to teach her is wrong? So she's just supposed to sit there. It says, learn in silence with all subjugation. But she might, what if that woman is me, and the guy, the man in church who's trying to teach me is he's a woke pastor who he's trying to teach,
Well,
what if
okay,
he's being a cringe and trying to teach me that well, I don't
right.
even know. But.
Well, I mean that's a great question, and of course you're coming from a Church of England context where there's a lot of those pastors that we could go after. I will say, Paul is harsh about pastors in general. I mean, his list of pastoral qualifications is long. So Paul wouldn't be a fan of Mr. Jellyfish woke pastor either. I think Paul would just say, yeah, fire the woke pastors. So it's an interesting question.
So it should be the place of a man to contradict the
exactly that,
the
and that's
lecture.
the key. So here's what I think Paul would say. I think Paul would say the woke pastor should be fired, but he should be fired by male non-woke pastors, basically.
Yeah, I think I can see the sense in that. All of this reminds me of something that Jordan Peterson got in some trouble for saying, like 2018, where he was saying that men don't really know how to put women in their place because they're forbidden to use sort of physical aggression against
remember
women.
that whole thing. Yeah. Oh gosh.
But more than that, I think
Yes.
men want to be more polite to women. They don't they don't want to come out and shoot them down. Like it's just sort of a part of chivalry, not just to not hit women, but also to not insult them or to embarrass them in public. So I think that women do have a way of some women have a way of taking advantage of that, where they will just walk all over any men present because they know that they're not going to get called out, and the women present are probably too timid to get into it with them.
Right, right, exactly. And I think it's that sort of situation that Paul is wants to anticipate. And he would see just something profoundly off about the image of like a female pastor whose husband, like say she was married, right? And so then her husband is part of her flock, and so like she's the shepherd and he's the sheep, and it's like, whoa, this is like backwards. This is not. This feels like the order is all wrong here. And the whole way that Paul was laying out, like that other pretext about managing the household, it's just like matter of course. Of course, we're talking about man who's head of household with wife and children, and then moves to pastoring church. So yeah, I think you're right. That's a good psychological point that you're bringing out, and it's true now as it was then.
So I was going to ask you, Bethel, in lines 11 and 12, when it's referring to a woman learning and a woman teaching, would that be purely in a biblical instance, as in like teaching the word of God, for example? Or would you say that it's a more widespread sort of statement about life and things that you can learn and teach in general, not specifically relating to anything church related?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think he is speaking in a church context specifically. I think he's because like in verse 8, he's has this picture of men praying, which that or men women adorning themselves, which seems like how they would adorn themselves to practice worship or attend a gathering of Christians or something like that. So it seems like he's talking about in the context of a church and church hierarchy, preaching and teaching about spiritual things. And like I was saying earlier, like we're so far removed culturally that there are now we have all of these contexts, like my mom in scholarship or academics, where she doesn't see it as contradicting Paul at all for her to write books where she says, wow, these male Christian scholars really screwed up their attempt to do biblical studies or whatever. Because it's not like she's practicing church discipline over them.
Okay.
Sorry, to pick up on a point you made earlier, there's this phrase that gets bandied around a lot with that the head of the household, which I think is an interesting way to phrase like who is in charge between a man and his wife. And I think it's an interesting phrase because literally referring to the household does raise an interesting sort of case study. And we got a super chat a few weeks ago that wasn't the highest paying one, but I was interested in addressing it about the historical context of women's sort of power in the world, like where a woman's place is in history, different civilizations, different current day sort of geographies in. It's such a huge topic. I don't even know how we would have addressed that. But thinking about Christianity and Islam and sort of more secular societies these days. But going back to more sort of ancient times and perhaps even the times that Paul was writing in. I'm not a historian. It's really kind of a weak point for me. But my understanding from what I've read is that the household was the only domain where women were powerful, where they had some authority, not over her husband, but over her children, her, perhaps even her like parents-in-law. The servants certainly would be the woman's sort of responsibility. These days it gets translated into, women being in charge of housework and spending of the household. That is the domain where she is powerful, so that her husband is then freed up to make all of the decisions outside of the house. It's a kind of specialization, to put it into economic terms, where the man, the husband, he needs to be focused on making money, on making decisions that affect the rest of the world, and to do that he needs to have a good wife she's responsible, she's assertive, and she has authority in the house, with like I said, with the servants and with the children. Those are her responsibility, and that is where she has sort of her free reign under his sort of guidance to some extent.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry. I was thinking about this earlier, and I kind of came to the question and a sort of need for a differentiation between relating to the household, duties that would be considered a responsibility and actions that would make an authority. Because when you were saying, Poe, things like relating to the household, I heard the words like authority and responsibility come up and almost be used interchangeably. And I think it's like very important to sort of differentiate those terms, especially when relating it to something that could have been commented on biblically, with what are the responsibilities of a woman, and do those in a sort of modern lens take away from what would be historically perceived as like a men's authority over her.
Well, the truth is that those words, authority and responsibility, I didn't mean to use them interchangeably, but I do think of them as related, just because definitely because of specifically because I was watching a very long video today by what is her name? The Authentic Observer. It's a YouTube channel by a young lady who I have been trying to get onto Women's Hour. So that's why I've been watching her videos. And she's just making these videos responding to like red pill type manosphere channels, where they talk about to give someone responsibility over something, it's unjust unless you give them authority in that domain. So that's the kind of fight of feminism, but then the battle of the sexes is who has, if you're going to take away men's authority, then you must also take away, that you no longer make them responsible for those things. So that's why I use those specific words, just because that's been on my mind lately today.
Relating responsibility with a lack of authority almost makes the position of a wife almost akin to that of a servant or someone performing a job, where let's say it's your job to do the dishes and clean the house. Those are your responsibilities, for example. But without authority in those sorts of positions, that's basically just being like a servant of sorts.
Yeah.
And I think it's especially true now, but even back in history, with accounts that I've read or sources that I've looked into, that it was very common for men to, accept that the wife does these things and she probably knows how to do them the best. So he's probably not going to like butt in about it, not to undermine his authority, but just because that isn't, like you were saying, his domain.
Yeah, I think the examples that I always think of are things like cooking and shopping,
Yeah.
where they're things that are, they're not trivial, right? You can't just go like do the shopping now because you'll do it, because there's like 1,000 decisions you have to make when it comes to to shopping, and especially if you're cooking meals, you then need to decide what those meals are going to be, how you're going to cook them, who's going to cook them, all of that. We talk about that sort of stuff a lot on Women's Hour, but the fact is that if you're the one who's responsible for doing the shopping, there's a certain logic to me of letting, if it's a woman, letting the woman then make the decisions relating to shopping, because she's the one, she's got to figure out how to get the money to stretch to pay all the bills and feed the family, and she needs the authority to be able to make those decisions, because she can't constantly be deferring to her husband on every single tiny decision about that. And if he says, why are we getting this cheap bread? Like, can't you get more expensive bread? She's going to have to say no, because the money's not going to stretch to that, or whatever the logic was behind that decision. It's going to be much more understood to her than it is to him, who isn't actually the one doing it.
Yeah, that's another thing that is especially a very hot topic these days with budgeting, for example. I mean, obviously, in a traditional sense, the man would be the breadwinner, but there are duties that a woman must perform, or traditionally would perform, that involves taking some of that bread and doing something with it. And I think that there definitely needs to be a conversation, or at least an understanding between both parties, the husband and the wife, of where that money is going, if it's being used productively, efficiently, that sort of thing. But going into like the specific like nitty-gritty, like, hey, why are you buying this rather than that? I mean, that's a question that is definitely a logical question. But it also, I don't know, it's strange, the sort of concepts of authority in these scenarios, because it's just something that is just kind of accepted into the subconscious, is that money, you need money to do things, but where the money is coming from, what it's being spent on, I mean, we could go on for hours and hours about this, so I'm gonna stop. But yeah, like looking at it through the lens of this verse especially, kind of makes for some very interesting thoughts that I've been having about that specific topic that I just brought up.
I had
Go on.
so Poe, if you could pull up Proverbs 31, that might be apt here.
I'd love to. Is this a good wife?
Yeah, Proverbs 31. If you want to type
can,
in 31, so that'll.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, there you go. So I think that, yeah, this is interesting. So when you starting in verse 10, just look at all the stuff that the good wife is doing here, right? So Yeah, there's lots of stuff about her managing the household, but there's also stuff about her deciding what to buy. Um, she considereth a field and buyeth it. With the fruit of her hands she planteth a vineyard. Um, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's involved in considering a field and buying it and then planting a vineyard, right? Um, she handles charity, right? So she stretcheth out her hand to the poor. She stretches forth her hands to the needy. So she's budgeting. Okay, we're going to do this for charity. This is for charity. This is for the field. This is for right. Um, she's looks like she's selling. There we go. She maketh fine linen and selleth it, and delivereth girdles unto the merchant.
Oh my goodness.
So she's a
Well done,
businesswoman, basically.
Yeah. No, I think that is its own topic, and I should mention that I did I'm going to stop sharing actually. I did a live stream on Lambda Bible studies about that specific passage from Proverbs. So rather than go over that again, I will direct people to Lambda Bible studies where we talked about a good wife, more valuable than rubies, etc. What I really want to get to the bottom of before the end of the stream, which is a question that kind of plagues my mind. To me, it seems like I figured out what is the domestic domain, the domain of the woman, the feminine, and what is the domain of the world. Like everything else is up to the man. That kind of makes sense to me. Not all, but most. There's a kind of a logic to that I can follow. But then when it comes to the spiritual domain and even to the political domain, sort of intellectual domain that we do these days, it doesn't necessarily fall into that dichotomy that easily. So these days we see is that women are much more religious than men in terms of like church going, praying, things like that. That's what I've heard. I don't have a study to support that, but it certainly seems
that's a definite trend. Certainly, there's been various research in the States that supports that, and then by extension, women tend to sort of drive a lot of the marketing decisions, like in evangelical circles, how books and things are marketed, how church programs are organized, the sort of the needs and perspectives of women often are kind of behind those and shaping those.
Yeah, that these days it feels like the churches wouldn't really run without women certainly helping. I don't know how much women are doing the organising themselves, but on all the committees that I've been on, it's usually a man who's the chair of the committee, but then you also need women being the treasurer or the secretary,
Yep.
taking down the minutes and all that, all that boring stuff. It seems these things do require women to operate, even if they're not in a leadership role. So I find that an interesting difficulty where these days the church is in such bad shape that I think it might just fall apart if you said that women couldn't even speak in church, which I think is the most sort of extreme interpretation. Can you confirm that, Bethel?
I think that would be an extreme interpretation. I think that I mean it's short, it's cryptic. There's a lot of ways that you could read that, but yeah, I mean that would be one way you could take it.
I think there are some. I don't know where I heard this, but I've heard that there are some churches that that do subscribe to that interpretation. That when the woman enters the building, she's literally just like nodding. That's all she's allowed to do. And I think it's maybe I'm thinking of certainly in Islam, but I think some sects of Christianity where women and men are sort of seated separately, even. But I guess the other case study that I wanted to look at is what we're doing on Women's Hour, where we instead of coming on here and trying to debate men and tell men what to do, there are certainly a lot of men who watch Women's Hour, but I try to make it for women. Like I'm talking to women for women to watch, and I don't want to lecture to men not because I believe that Saint Paul was divinely inspired to write that absolutely correct take in his letter to Timothy, but because I think he's probably pretty much right, even if he was a bit of an incel or whatever. What would you call it? Is that sacrilege? I'm sorry. Maybe he was a bit of a curmudgeon when it came to women.
Maybe he was a volcel.
Yeah, well, yeah. I will say there is something about unmarried men that doesn't make me I'm not like suspicious of them, but there does seem to be a certain kind
Tone
of
deafness.
there's a certain like archetype. I don't know, like I wouldn't say all unmarried men, but there's a certain archetype of a kind of unmarried man who thinks he's won the bargain. Like he was so clever to avoid getting married. He's like a little bit smug about it.
Well, there's this that famous other passage where Paul is talking about marriage and singleness, where he advises couples, okay, look, if you just need to get a room, then get married and then get a room. Basically, that's just the extreme paraphrase of that. But and then it's interesting because he makes this. We were discussing divine inspiration earlier. Paul does this interesting thing where he goes, now, I'm just going to say something for me. This is just my opinion, okay? I feel like it would be better if everyone was single. He goes, I could wish that everyone was single like me, and then they could do all this good stuff for the church, and things would just be simpler that way. That's just me talking, though. And so I love that. I think that's funny when he does stuff like that.
But even in his sort of that mindset that he's in, he still respects the sort of quote authority of women to perform childbirth and to keep the church going.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like there's especially in I know I keep on bringing up like modern times, but there's men in a similar position to Paul that choose to be by themselves for whatever reason, and they still respect the separation of man and woman, even if they don't choose to interact with women. They respect the duties of woman, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. There's also an interesting theological bit here. Sorry if this goes too far off track, but I just think it's interesting. This little bit at the very end where he goes, notwithstanding she shall be saved in childbearing.
Yeah, that's what I was referencing.
Right, yeah, and coming from Paul, I mean, Paul is like this, by grace through faith, you're not saved by your own works guy, right? I mean, he's beating that drum over and over all throughout his letters. And here, you could read this in a way of saying that the work of childbearing is salvific for women. What's up with that? What does he mean by that? And I think it's an archetype, man. It's like, I'm going to put my Jordan Peterson hat on here because he's just been talking about Adam and Eve. So I think he's sort of harking back to the first sin of woman, capital W, Eve's first sin, and how through her childbearing eventually came Jesus Christ, who was the savior of mankind. So it was like through the fruit of Eve's womb, she herself was saved, and all of the descendants who came after her were saved, even though she was the one who had initially damned them through her sin. And so that I'm still chewing on that verse, frankly. I'm still thinking about what all exactly he means by that, but I think there's definitely an archetypal element to that, which of course Paul thinks is literal. I mean, he believed in an actual first man and first woman. It's not just a literary type for him.
Well, that's certainly interesting, and I'm interested to learn more about Paul because he writes very well, and I enjoy him as a character. But coming back to that sort of archetype of childbearing, I do like that idea that that childbearing is the very best thing that women can do, even if they do it badly, and even if they're still they become Karens afterwards. Even if they're still a bit too overbearing and and harridans. If they've produced the next generation, they've at least done one good thing with their life. And for many women, whether they're good or bad, I think bearing children becomes the best thing that they do.
Yeah.
Really, it's the most lasting effect you can have on the world.
Yeah, that's profound. That's really profound to think about. And when you think about women who are just in terrible situations, maybe women who've had a lot of children out of wedlock, right? And they'll say, "Well, I made these babies. Like, these kids are the one good thing about my life, and I've kind of screwed up everything else, but at least I have these kids." That's very profound.
Absolutely.
Unless those kids are serial killers who end up killing more than they've
Oh, thanks, Poe.
than
You
they account for.
had to go and ruin the mood. You're having
Well,
a moment here.
most children don't become serial killers, but the ones who are serial killers often have very bad mothers, I should say.
Well, that's
But,
true. Yeah,
like really, really, really bad mothers, though.
not wrong.
I wanted to just touch on before we wrap this up, this verse about modesty, about adorning yourself in modest apparel with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with broidered hair or gold or pearls or costly array, which I feel very smug about because I'm quite a plain dresser. I don't really wear jewelry except my engagement ring. So I like to hold my head high and proudly think that St. Paul would approve of me. But then that's
Yeah, me too. I just like throw on a turtleneck and jeans or whatever. I'm not like the kind of fancy lady he seems to be picturing here.
but that's not being very shamefaced, is it? So
Yeah,
well,
I mean, the one thing about King James, I love the King James, but I sometimes their translations are a little bit unclear. So something like the ESV or the NIV might, because I don't know that shamefaced quite captures what he's going for there. I think what he's trying to convey is just that they're not showing off, basically, that they're not being flashy.
Yeah. No, I was just being a little bit self what's the word self-effacing by saying that there's pride, there's an unvirtuous form of pride that is nothing to do with physical apparel and beauty, that to take such a enjoyment in what others think of you, and holding yourself above other people is
Yes, yeah.
is sinful in a slightly different way, even if you're not wearing gold or pearls or costly array.
That is true. That is very true. We also don't know. This may be another case where we're missing some cultural context. Like but maybe at the time this sort of stuff was like a marker for something, or it sort of like indicated that you were. I don't know. I guess he's talking about trying to sort of separate yourself from the world, from the culture of the time, so that you're standing out.
I think too, it's possible to interpret this as, like I think I forgot who said it. The flashiness. A lot of people misinterpret this as you have to dress ugly, like you cannot ordain yourself quote beautifully.
Yeah, that's
I
not
guess
true.
I interpret this a lot more as like I would say now the people with name brand bags, and they like will throw on like a really gaudy like chain just because it's like super expensive, or name brand this, name brand that, rather than caring about the aesthetic of it all and how you're presenting yourself outwardly. You're wearing those garments just to kind of brag about your wealth and your standing in society.
Yeah.
And I don't think by any means that a modest form of dress has to be simple, like in Poe's case. Like that's completely fine, and I love that style too. But you can also ordain yourself in the way you choose to, without kind of being like I don't know, without being just like toffish about it, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I can remember being a little kid, and we would try and find modest dresses, and we found one great company online where women handmade them, and you would pick out what cloth you wanted or whatever, and they were gorgeous. They were like really beautiful dresses. So there can be a real attractiveness, and some of the ladies I grew up with at my hometown were like that as well. So that the frumpy, ugly modest girl. I mean, it's sort of like it's a straw man painted by people who want to pretend that conservative Christianity is this like drab, joyless, colorless
Yeah,
affair.
absolutely.
Yeah, well, I don't know about dresses, but in general, yes, I do find that quite annoying these days when I see Christianity portrayed in that way to make Christians look boring and yeah, joyless, like you say. That when that's kind of a view that I subscribed to due to watching too much TV when I was a kid, and only as an adult looking back on the stuff that I thought was really interesting and exciting at that time was really that was what was quite joyless actually. But I want to come back to interpreting Bible verses. I do find it a little bit tedious sometimes because it's so open to interpretation. For instance, the verse about a rich man going through the eye of a camel going through the eye of a needle. That's how difficult it is for a rich man to go to heaven. And I think everyone who reads that thinks like, oh, but I'm not the rich man. Like, I'm not that rich.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how rich someone is. They can always go like, oh yeah, but that verse isn't about me. They're talking about people who are richer than me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what it's like with I'm sure there's no woman who reads the verse about dressing to adorning herself with whatever who thinks that verse is about her. I think it's just it's one of those hard truths that we don't know exactly how flashy is too flashy for a woman, or how rich is too rich to get into heaven.
I'm of the belief that you can dress sort of flashy and flauntingly at any wealth. I think that if you look presentable, then you look presentable, and that should be that. It shouldn't be wearing things with the intention of making you seem like you have more monetary wealth in that sense. It's just, for me, it's always been something that's very unattractive, but upon my sort of return to religion, it's become even more so because I have this context to support my belief in that and that moral standing. So, yeah.
Can I tell you, this is going way off topic, but I wanted to bring it up on Women's Hour at some point, that my for years now, my aspiration with how I present myself and how I dress and speak in public, I'm aspiring to a very specific level of wealth where I'm from old money. That's how I'm trying to like present myself. That I'm so rich. I come from such a wealthy family that I don't even have pretensions of wealth. I don't even need to adorn myself or to act pretentious, because that's just how much I have. I'm trying to like fall in with like the tasteful rich crowd by being like them. That's my aim. I don't know how well I'm doing. Bethel, did you have some closing thoughts about this or anything that we've talked about, and then I think we'll end the show.
Yeah, let me think about this. So I'm glad that you invited me to come on here, because it was just a nice little opportunity for me to sit down, take another look at this passage, and kind of get my thoughts together. So it was good to think about how, on the one hand, a lot has changed that Paul in his context wasn't even foreseeing or really able to imagine, and like different ways that women at the church could use their skills, which I think are necessary and valuable. But I'm still convinced of what I think Paul's initial point was, that there is a hierarchy, there is a structure woven into kind of the warp and woof, the fabric of things, the dance between man and woman, that there's something off about the woman sort of hijacking men's authority in the church, that it should be men exercising authority. But to your point, Poe, a very good point, which plagues many churches in the States as well as in England, increasingly we have a lot of unqualified men. We have a lot of pastors who just have no business pastoring. So then I think to the sensible women who are sort of suffering under these pastors, I would say find a different pastor. Just get out of there. You don't have to stay under that wimpy, unmanly, woke pastor. And then I would say to the non-woke pastors, clean house, man. Like get rid of your wimpy, unmanly pastors, and set your house in order, as Peterson would say.
Thanks. Okay, anything from you, Cows? Should we wrap it up?
Yeah, I've said everything I need to say. So yeah.
Okay, well, I think we had, so next week, I think we're going to try to review Whisper of the Heart and talk about teen romance, and I'm so excited. You're both invited back on for that, or we might try and get some other ladies, depending on who's free to do their movie homework and to be on the show. So, thank you all for joining me tonight, and thanks to my guests especially. And I'll see you next week. Have a good night and have a good weekend.
Bye.